movements. And so how is racialized capitalism relevant to the movements that we see across the country for defund? Specifically, what are the connections between policing and racialized capitalism? And also to think through what else is possible. I think very often we get kind of caught on that question, but there's so many folks, organizers and lawyers across the country who are really thinking about and experimenting with other types of economies and relationships, and how do we actually engage and lean into that and make sure that our praxis of lawyering and of organizing really is exploring and growing the possibilities outside of the capitalist system, which we know cannot exist with all value and humanity in mind. And so we're super excited to have 4 dope panelists with us today. First, we have Bianca Cunningham, who is with DSA and is a former union organizer who would talk a lot about socialism and capitalism and the ways in which she's organizing at those intersections and the work that she's doing. We also have Julian Hill, who is a clinical teaching fellow at the Social Enterprise and Nonprofit Law Clinic at Georgetown, who's also a dope-ass movement lawyer. We'll talk a bit about the ways in which capitalism has shown up in his work and the ways we can combat it. And then we have Jaribu Hill, who is a favorite of ours, an amazing movement lawyer and executive director of Mississippi Workers Center for Human Rights, who will talk about racialized capitalism and the work that she is spearheading throughout the South and the country that is kind of tackling that. And then lastly, we have Renee Hatcher, who is the director of the Community Enterprise and Solidarity Economy Clinic and assistant professor at UIC John Marshall Law School, who is a long-time clinical cohort, amazing champion of Alpha BL and really someone who we admire greatly. And we'll talk about solidarity economies. And so again, super grateful for the panel. We were supposed to also have Kazembe Jackson join us, but unfortunately because of the extreme weather that's happening throughout the South and the country, another example of capitalism and environmental injustice, they can't be with us tonight. So please send your thoughts to Georgia and to Kazembe, who won't join us. But again, we're super excited. So we're gonna just actually start out with short introductions from each of our panelists, and they're gonna each define for us kind of one of the terms, whether it's racialized capitalism, solidarity economies, socialist feminism, that is gonna kind of undergird our conversation tonight. So I'm gonna start us off actually with Jaribu Hill to talk a bit about racialized capitalism and also just the amazing work that you do and what brings you here tonight.
Well, thank you, Marbre, and thank you, my comrades from Law for Black Lives and everyone on the screen. Solidarity and blessings and love to all of you. We are just a day away from the 65th anniversary of Emmett Till's lynching, of Emmett Till. And when we talk about racialized capitalism, that's what comes to mind: the disposability of Black bodies, the theft of our innocence, the theft of our skin, and how we address that issue, how we show up. When we look at Emmett Till's life that was snuffed out when he was 14 years old, and what is the connection between Emmett and George and Bianca? What is the connection between Trayvon and Sandra and Eleanor Bumpers, a 67-year-old grandmother? The connection is clear that Black bodies swing from trees, Black bodies are disposable, Black bodies are there to make profit. And I was looking at some of the definitions from writings and readings that I've been a student of all along when I looked at this issue again of racialized capitalism. And I really, really have embraced a definition that sounds a lot like me. Sounds like what I would say if someone asked me, what is racialized capitalism? And I'll just share it with you. Racialized capitalism, making money off Black and brown bodies. And we know this to be true. From the auction block enterprise to now, we know this to be true. And that the whole issue of the commodification of non-whites for social and economic gain, we know this to be true. We see it in the bloody Deep South, we see it in the frozen North, we see it everywhere Black people are, everywhere we were dropped off, everywhere we are laying in wait in colonized zones, we see that our bodies are disposable, our bodies are part of the enterprise, part of the capitalist profiteering machine. So I'll finally end with this, so lest I go over the 5-minute mark, and you will have to just time me from time to time because I have a tendency to forget. Not that I don't want to share and have other people share, but sometimes you just get going and you don't know when to stop. But I'll say one last thing, and that is that capitalism racialized capitalism began really, really with the auction block. It began with the involuntary trade, as someone educated me and told me, Jaribu, don't say slave trade, because trade means there was some reciprocity. There was none. There was no reciprocity. So the involuntary trade is actually has emerged as the beginning of capitalism. It's a system that's been racialized since the beginning, and it cannot exist without wholesale suffering and inequality. It's a system that from the beginning relied on what? Uncompensated labor. And where did that labor come from? Whose labor was that? That was Black sweat, Black toil, and Black blood. And so I leave you with that just to open it up and look forward to the discussion.
Okay, thank you so much. And I just want to encourage folks to use the chat box for both shout outs and questions, but that was an incredible beginning, Julian. You are a preacher at heart, so I appreciate you. I'm going to go next to Julian to talk a bit about the work that you do and kind of the perspective that you bring to this conversation.
Cool, good evening, family. So I'm Julian, he, him, they, them pronouns. For those who need the support, I'm an almond-colored, bald-headed brother with a Black beard. I'm wearing a Black t-shirt with yellow, green, and red African print on the right shoulder. And so I'm an outgoing supervising attorney at Take Root Justice, where I mostly worked with worker cooperatives. And aside from being a teaching fellow at Georgetown, I'm also one of the co-chairs for the New York City chapter of BYP 100. And so that's kind of how I orient my work. I'm about both abolition as well as creating alternative systems that are cooperative. And so the term I wanted to bring into the space is something that people don't maybe talk about super often, which is monopolies. And so, you know, I'm not an economist, but when I think of a monopoly, I think of basically an exclusive or, you know, very concentrated control of the ability to sell a product or a service. So essentially, we're talking about situations where, and you can pick really any industry, you can talk about social networks, healthcare, dog food, smartphone providers, where anywhere from 1 to 4 companies literally control those markets. So that means that, for example, if you like peanut butter with your jelly, like me, right? 92% of the peanut butter that folks consume, at least as of 2018, came from 4 companies, right? And so the ways in which I think about monopolies and how it impacts my work, two ways. So one is I do a lot of work with small businesses and commercial leases. As you all know, small businesses in New York City, at least, which is where I'm located, are getting demolished. And I'm sure it's the same for a lot of other folks here on the call in your cities. And so one of the concerns really is around what happens with these spaces. How is the real estate industry, how are private equity firms going to kind of come through and try to continue to concentrate a lot of the power that they already have in the city, which in a lot of ways is the capital of capital. And then 2, in my work with worker cooperatives, you know, we're really trying to build alternative relationships that folks have with the products that they provide and the services that they provide. And, you know, monopolies obviously make it hard for worker cooperatives to compete. And so where folks are trying to do things like dog walking, where folks are trying to do things like, you know, Spanish education, et cetera, you know, monopolies are an issue that I feel like isn't talked about as much as they could be, but have super, super deep implications on the work that I do and just the life that I live day to day. And so I'll stop there.
Thank you, and I appreciate you bringing monopoly into this space, because I think there's a lot of kind of the mechanisms of capitalism and how it interacts and looks in our economy that we don't talk much about. So I think it's important to think through that. So thank you, Julian. And next I'm gonna have Renee introduce herself and talk a bit about the work that you do, Renee, and also solidarity economies, which I think gets us into kind of bridging into, if not this, then what conversations.
Yeah, so thank you, Marbre. Thank you, L4BL, for organizing this. Thank you. I'm glad to be in this space with such brilliant people. So I'm Renee Hatcher. As Marbre said, I'm a UIC law professor, and I run a clinic called the Community Enterprise and Solidarity Economy Clinic. And essentially what we do is provide free legal support in Chicago and the surrounding area to people who really want to control their own destinies, who want to further self-determination of communities and neighborhoods, who want to have a say in their workplace, who don't want to be exploited, who don't want to be pushed out by impending gentrification. So more or less what we do is really provide legal support to organizations, whether they be nonprofit or for-profit, that really are taking agency over their lives and building the institutions that actually serve them and the ones that will provide the things that they need to thrive, right? And so, I'm really glad to be a part of this conversation, in part to constantly and continuously make these connections between state-sanctioned violence, right, and the violence of our economy, or the violence of capitalism or racialized capitalism, and how those two, both, you know, what we think is the police state and the economy, work hand in hand and reinforce each other in different ways, right? So we know in part, right, the origins of police really come from trying to control the labor force in the North, trying to squash a labor rebellion in the South from slave patrols, and trying to ensure that Black folks can't get free, right? And so, you know, in thinking about the ways in which the police have developed, and thinking about the ways in which the economy really, this economy is based off of private property rights, right? Those two things are two sides of the same coin. And we have to address both to actually address, you know, the types of oppression and really the violence that we see in Black communities. So in terms of solidarity's economy, that's how I frame my work. That's how I both think about my work as a lawyer, my work as, you know, what I hope to be the end product in supporting folks who are trying to build solidarity economies. And really what that means is that people that are trying to build an economy, both local and global, right, that are centered around the needs of people and the sustainability of the planet, right? Because we all have to inhabit the planet to actually live, right, and thrive. So really, and in simplest form, a solidarity economy or solidarity economy is about centering the needs of people and the planet in terms of what that looks like. There's a theory behind it. Part of it is just the recognition that we don't simply meet our needs, and we need to think more expansive about the economy. I think when we start talking about capitalism, when we start talking about the economy, I think folks don't necessarily always feel well equipped to have that conversation. But really all the economy is all the ways in which we meet our material needs. And some of those things are in the formal economy, where we go into a store and we purchase things, but so much of it is in the informal economy, and relying, for example, on familial support and family and friends, for example, just to be able to live your daily life, whether that be, you know, your grandmother doing childcare, or your sister bartering with you or providing something for you in gift exchange. And so solidarity economy really takes an expansive view of the economy, in that all the mutual aid work that's been going on. So for example, you know, one of the things I think that this pandemic exposed was that the government doesn't necessarily have our back. And what I've been seeing in communities is really that people have each other's back. So all of the mutual aid efforts that sprung up, right, that's a part of the solidarity economy. People who have been exploited by their boss and decided to quit and start their own business with a group of folks, to start a worker co-op, to own their own labor, to have a say over their working conditions. That's a part of the solidarity economy. And so I think, I'm not sure if I'm over time, but I'll stop there and we can get more into it as we go along.
Y'all are all under time, so I'm hella impressed, but we are good. So I'm gonna move it to Bianca now to talk a bit about the work you do, Bianca, but also I think define for us socialist feminism, which feels like it really talks about the intersection of both patriarchy and capitalism and racism in really important ways. So I'll pass it to you, Bianca.
Sure, and thank you so much for having me. My name is Bianca Cunningham. My pronouns are she and they. I'm based out of Brooklyn, New York, and I work in the labor movement. I come out of the labor movement. I'm a labor organizer. I organize workers to improve conditions and fight back against their bosses in the ruling class. And I also am a national spokesperson for the Democratic Socialists of America. as well as like founder or co-founder of the Afro-Socialist and Socialist of Color Caucus. And so I'm really happy to be here with you all. I did get tasked with defining socialist feminism, and it's so funny when you asked me to do this, Marbre, I was like, oh, here we go. And I forgot about that video that's up of me doing socialist feminism. But, you know, to be quite honest, I entered the movement through the frame of labor and never identified myself as a feminist, mostly because of the ways that I was introduced to feminism. It was normally white women who were college educated, middle class, and me coming from the background that I came from into movement spaces, I felt incredibly alienated. And like that, reproductive justice wasn't my main issue. And so I never really embraced it. But I'll tell you, when I started to embrace it is whenever I started to learn my history. When I started learning about, you know, Angela Davis, and started like reading her work about, you know, socialist feminism, essentially, and also reading like the statement from Combahee River Collective. I mean, that was whenever I started to realize that socialist feminism is just about ending economic and cultural oppression of all women. It's that simple. It's them that they're complicating it and making it like classist and elitist and, you know, all of the things. And so that's what socialist feminism is. I just want to say a little bit about how it's different from other forms of feminism. I myself, I come out of, I used to work in a retail shop. I organized my own, me and my coworkers organized to join a union. And in the process of that, we were really introduced into all of the ways that capital and the ruling class undermine workers every single day. We were really familiar with exploitation because our wages were already being decreased, right? And that's one of the reasons we wanted to organize. We also come to organizing because we were experiencing sexual harassment by our boss. And so there was this intersection, to your point, about patriarchy, about the ways that our labor was being exploited, and just our experience, you know, being in the workplace as people of color, as Black people. And so when we went to organize against this big company, they kind of threw everything at us, and I essentially ended up getting fired for unionizing, although it is completely legal to unionize your workplace. But your boss will always find a way and a loophole to get rid of you. And so yes, they got rid of me. And I just want to say a little bit about my process, just because this is a Law for Black Lives call, and it wouldn't be right to not go through the case. So initially, when they fire me, my union files charges with the National Labor Relations Board and says it's illegal to fire her for forming a union. The Labor Relations Board attorneys look at the case and look at both arguments and decide, yes, you have fired her illegally. The company then gets to appeal that. 3 months later, we go to a trial. And witnesses are introduced, a judge sits, and then decides based on the arguments made, and it takes a couple weeks. 6 months later, they decide that I was in fact illegally fired and that they need to restore me and put me back to work. Well, then the company can appeal again. And this time they appeal to the the Labor Secretary's office in DC. At that time, Trump was just being elected and inaugurated. And so there was nobody there. And so they rubber stamp the decision and say, we're just gonna uphold whatever the decision was. Great, we're still winning. This is the third time. The company can then appeal again. And they take me to the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the most conservative court, and I'm sure you all know this, in the United States. Neil Gorsuch is one of my judges. You have 3 judges. They look at all of the previous arguments. They hear, you're allowed to introduce new arguments. And the company was waiting on this particular court because they knew that this was a conservative court. And the 2 out of the 3 judges, all of a sudden, 3 years later, decide that I was, in fact, not fired illegally. And so then I am done with my recourse. I have nowhere to go except for the Supreme Court, and the likelihood of them accepting a case like this is very small. I say all that to say, this happens to millions of people every single day, and people that don't even have the economic ability or even mental ability to stay with a process for 3 years to fight these companies. And so these companies have no recourse for breaking the law. This is why I'm an anti-capitalist, because I understand this. The law doesn't protect us. And just as we're talking right now in mainstream discourse about who are the police accountable to, we need to also be asking ourselves, who is capital and the ruling class accountable to? And so I'll end there because I'm sure I'm out of time.
And with the mic drop, thank you for that. There was so much in that was juicy. I want to thank you also for sharing your experience. But I think one thing you got to that feels really important to name is the ways that the law legitimizes capitalism, right? And the way that police therefore become the enforcers of that legitimization. And so I think that's really important, the kind of the violence of the law itself, and also upholding these systems and normalizing and legitimizing them. And so I just want to thank you for sharing that. And I feel like that's a kind of, it's a helpful bridge. I want us to do a little bit kind of a deeper dive into what is the problem. And so why is capitalism such a problem, especially for Black folks, especially for folks identifying as women or as queer folks. And so I want to ask you, Jaribu, to talk to us a bit about this long-standing love affair between capitalism and racism. And especially in the work you do in the South, but across the globe, really, what is the connection between racism and capitalism? And also between policing and capitalism. And so what are the ways in which policing, and I think Renee touched on this, that the development of policing in this country is so tied to the maintenance of capital. But we'd love to hear more about, kind of, for you, the intersection of racism and capitalism and policing. You're on mute.
I was doing so good with that.
I know, I see you following instructions.
At first I did. I was muted and I unmuted, but I'm back to forgetting. I'm really glad that this portion of the conversation is steeped in Southern realities. As I was preparing my short remarks, I titled them Capitalism and Deep South Toil. The relationship between capital, because we were in fact counted as capital, counted as property, counted as breathing cargo. And of course, when we were disrupting and resisting, we were counted as strange fruit. So from the beginning, when you look at Deep South toil, you look at work in the South, and you add the layer of the so-called gig economy to that, our folks are completely excluded and locked out of rights. Our people have no recourse. Most workers are either agricultural workers or food processing workers who languish in pits across the Deep South, where I'm located in the Mississippi Delta. 43% of the population in the land of my parents and my grandparents is steeped in poverty. And Julian is my home person. He can attest to this in terms of how still it looks like back in the day with regard to the way workers are treated, with regard to the systems that they are forced to work in. Many, many workers do not have bathroom rights. We have known workers to have to wear Pampers back in the day, to tape a pamper in the front and a pamper in the back to keep from soiling their clothes while working because they were denied the right to go to the bathroom. That shows up still today. It shows up still today in workplaces across the South. It certainly shows up in Mississippi, where after slavery, the largest number of lynchings were recorded thanks to Ida B. Wells' Red Record. And so we see over and over again this gig economy showing up, where our brothers and sisters are tagged and branded as temporary workers. Temporary, but working for 1 to 15 years, still being classified as temporary workers, having no benefits, having no job security. And in the COVID epidemic, we see so starkly how not only are our people the ones who are dying at alarming, disproportionate rates, we also are being made jobless at disproportionate rates. We are retaliated against when we ask for simple things like PPE. At this one place where we're working hard with brothers and sisters who are laundry workers here in Greenville, Mississippi, they in fact you will see when you go to hotels and you fold back those crisp white sheets and you go and get a towel after your shower. These are the workers who process those items for hotels across our region. And of course, their sisters and brothers in other regions. And the reason I bring that up is because these same workers ask their bosses at Broadway Linen, please provide us with masks. They told them, if you want masks, you have to buy your own. Well, making less wages, and that's what capitalism is, less wages for more profit and more work out of us. That's what we're seeing in the Deep South. It is woefully anti-union, and as my sister Bianca lifted up union organizing, that is where you will see we still are lifting up the slogan and wondering when are we actually going to see wholesale organizing in the South? We just don't see it. Most workers have to fend for themselves, and when they do try to organize, they are retaliated against, they are moved out of the workforce and other more compliant workers are put in their place. Nissan is the last example I'll lift up. And I also want to do the disclaimer that I do when I start to lift up companies. I am lifting these companies up as Jaribu Hill, a representative of the Mississippi Workers Center for Human Rights that's been established since 1996. My organization gives me permission to lift up corporations. I want to make sure I'm clear that this is Jaribu talking about Nissan, where a couple of years ago, workers did try to unionize. And in that effort, 1,300 workers voted for the union, 2,300 voted against it. Why is that? Why is that? It's because the brutal system itself, violating every law, and we don't have many laws that protect workers, but the National Labor Relations Act is supposed to be one of those acts that protects workers from that type of retaliation. You should be able to congregate, right, and organize with others to rid yourself of the suffering. Well, they told them, look, if you go with the union, all those who have leased cars, you're going to have to turn those cars in. That's a violation. That's illegal. That's threatening me with a reprisal because I have a leased car from you. You're saying I'm going to be without transportation if I don't vote against the union. And showing videos like, if you love the union, you hate Nissan. So this pattern of anti-unionism, anti-worker, this pattern goes on because the class is not fully radicalized. The class does not understand that we could topple, we could take it if we were unified, if we were united, and race always gets in the way. Racism is a stringent byproduct, as is patriarchy, as is sexism and chauvinism and ableism. These are byproducts of that system that prop it up on every leaning side. So yes, we're seeing workers put out of work. We're seeing the temp system on steroids where people can work 15 years and still be told that they're a temp and not get benefits. And I confronted Mars, Uncle Ben's rice company, about this at a listening session that I was invited to. And I often don't know why I'm invited to certain spaces, because when I get there, you know I'm gonna kick your ass. Why invite me? Why? So they did, and they asked me, well, what do you think about Mars? Why would you ask me that question? Why would you ask me about the Mars that makes Snickers, but also has people working 15 years as temporary? Well, that's the first thing I unloaded, the low wages and the temp system that they use as a workforce. So these are just some of the things we're seeing, and they're mirrored in other places. It's not regional, but in the South, in the aftermath of chattel work and chattel slavery, we do see a particular style of oppression that keeps rearing its ugly head.
Thank you for that, always. And for speaking the truth wherever you go. So I'm gonna ask you, Bianca, to kind of continue about this conversation around how you see fights against capitalism showing up in these defund fights. And so I know that you were one of the organizers who pushed really hard here in New York City to try and defund the police, which is the most well-oiled and well-funded armies across the globe, actually. So we'd love to hear kind of just your own thoughts on how you see these fights connected and what that means for your work.
Yeah, so defund the police. Well, first of all, I'm a police abolitionist. So I see defund the police as a step towards abolition, but understand the cultural work that needs to happen in our society to get towards abolition. It's the same cultural work that needs to happen in our society to work towards anti-capitalism. And so that's first and foremost. But what we look at, and Julian was with me in our fight to defund the NYPD, who was operating on a public-facing $6 billion budget. On a private, if you look at all their private coffers, it doubles itself to almost $12 billion. And as you pointed out, they are the 5th largest military in the world. And so our fight to defund the police is really, the goal is to decrease the scope and the power and the money that the police have, because we don't feel like they should be first responders. We don't feel like, I think something I read in an article, 4% of the calls that come in to the NYPD are actually reporting a violent crime. The other 96% are noise complaints and interpersonal disputes and domestic disputes. And we can certainly find more creative ways to handle those issues. I also want to point to like the militarization that we've seen the police have, especially in this recent uprising. But, we've seen this for the past decade, the militarization of the police, where they're able to have, all kinds of military grade toys, weapons and tear gas and canisters to unleash upon citizens, while we see teachers and nurses and other workers who actually give value and service to our society scrambling, doing GoFundMes for funding. And so we were looking to move those funds from the police to things that actually keep us safe. And I also wonder, in the vein of socialist feminism, if there's a reason why these mostly female occupations like like nursing and teachers are over here starving for resources, while a male-dominated occupation like policing has all of the bells and whistles and even more than they would ever need. And so we want to take that back, and that's what we say whenever we mean defund the police. We want to take those things away from them and take the mechanism that they use to harm our communities, as well as just their presence, period. Private prisons is another way. When you defund, like, prisons is a lot of money, private prison and public prison. Let's be real. There's money and keeping people in prison, both because of private interest, but also because of prison labor, which we see, even Kamala Harris, one of the main reasons why she didn't want to reduce the prison population in California is because he said, no, we need the labor. We have these contracts with these big corporations. And so everybody's complicit in this system. Government, capital, ruling, corporations, they're all complicit. And we're looking to take a chunk of that power away from them. And the last thing I'll say is that if who remembers in Ferguson, when it came out that they were writing these ridiculous amounts of tickets to an already impoverished community as a means to bring in revenue for the city. Well, that happens in every city. And this is a vicious cycle. I can't tell you how many times, my little brother has to go to court for a speeding ticket, then he has to miss work, and then, he just got the job, but then, it's just like in a cycle, then he loses the job because he has to go to court. It's a lot. And I just feel like we're looking to reduce all of that situation, and we have to understand how that's all intrinsically linked. There's a lot of money. That's why organizations like ALEC exist, to try to write things into law, to try to expand the scope of what it means, of what criminalize everything. They want to criminalize everything, so they have every excuse. And this starts from Jim Crow. And so this is not anything new. We've been seeing this from back then. The goal is to throw Black and brown people in jail. The goal is to get free labor because they don't have, the slavery, there's a whatever. So that's the goal, and we understand that. And so you have to understand how these two things are linked. Capitalism needs racism to exist. It needs patriarchy to exist. It can't exist without those divisions.
Thank you so much for that. And I feel like, the kind of underlying reality is that the ways in which laws and lawyers are used to reinforce those systems, right? And so the ways in which, I think I said this earlier, the ways in which laws legitimize this extractive capitalism, and then the ways in which police enforce that, but also ways that lawyers are complicit in some ways in different professions. And so, Julia, I'm curious, for you and the work that you do, how can lawyers show up to combat or mitigate the harms of capitalism? If we're part of a system that reinforces it, that creates it, and that makes it so violent, what can we do also to use our skills to mitigate it? And what kinds of things have you done throughout your career to do that?
So I have a confession. I was actually, I've been, I guess, a corporate attorney longer than I've been sort of like a movement attorney, technically. I'm edging the halfway part. And so two things I wanted to lift up, just in terms of the latter part of your question, that I think goes under the radar, is really the emotional violence and trauma that folks experience both as laborers and as consumers, that goes beyond their time in those spaces, right? And so as a former big law attorney, I was often wow, all of these really well-meaning, nice people, right? Rationalizing work, and we're talking about 12 plus, 14 plus hour days, that we all know ultimately leads to negative outcomes for the communities that we care about, right? And so there's that. And then as I think about my work now, even where we're forming worker cooperatives, a lot of that, those harmful norms are replicated, right? And so how we treat each other. And so there's a lot of conflict that we have to work through in some of the worker co-op spaces that we're in. And also just because I think it's helpful for your original question, is thinking about like transnationally, right? And so like the oppression that we're experiencing on the city level, on the community level, on the state level, is also replicated on the nation state level. And so I think if you look up the debt that other countries and some of their largest state-owned entities, so like your oil and gas company, your steel company, have, like, it's incredible. And, you know, we're talking about billions and billions of dollars, like annually. Like, let's just take out these bonds, right? Or let's take out this loan. And who holds that debt is US and European banks and investors. And so we're talking about whole countries who are like hostage to capital. And if you want to look at a case study, Argentina in the 2010s, what happened when a couple US investors was like, nah, pay up, and the impact that they had on their economy. To your actual question, and I'm sorry, I'm coming back, I'm whipping back over, is sort of how folks can show up. And so thinking about my experience in Big Law, you know, I often thought about myself as someone who's like getting intel. You know, on the one hand, I didn't rationalize my work. Like, I have blood on my hands, and I know that my work led to negative outcomes, and I can't rationalize that. And a lot of those well-meaning people could really do a lot of service to movement around like demystifying and explaining a lot of these processes that are really going on every single day, right? Facebook, Apple, what are the implications of these talks around monopoly and the impact on our daily lives? Like these folks have that understanding and are able to unpack it. And so that's one thing. And then the last thing I'll say around how folks can show up is really around, and again, this is as a transactional attorney, is how to support in building anti-oppressive forms of governance, and most importantly, institutions, right? And so a lot of folks who do transactional work, like we do governance stuff, and the questions are the same. How do we make decisions? What are our values? What happens when we don't live up to those values? And so there's a lot of transferability. And when we're talking about building out what's the alternative, like those skills can be extremely valuable. The good parts, not the bad parts. So that's kind of where I see myself situated. That's where I see myself continuing to grow, because there's so much I still need to learn. I'm learning from Renee. There are a couple other people who I'm not going to name who I'm learning from on this call. So those are a couple of my offerings.
Thank you for that, and for the confession. All of us, I think in different ways, have blood on our hands. I appreciate that. I also feel like one thing you said that resonates with me is that capitalism is both an economic system, but it's also a cultural system in some ways. There's a set of values around disposability, around scarcity, that I think that we adopt even in anti-capitalist places and spaces. We very often recreate and re-entrench deeply, deeply problematic and disposability politics. And so I want to ask you, Renee, because I feel like you're somebody who is really working to create alternative visions of what is possible in both systems, but also in interpersonal relationships and personal kind of relationships. And so I'm curious for you about what are the dangers of capitalism, both economically and system-wise, but also personally, and what are the promises of solidarity economies?
Yeah, so that's a big question. So let me start with this. I actually think in some ways, the personal transformation is more difficult than building alternative institutions, right? In part because it requires us to unlearn so much of what we've learned, so much of the way in which we engage with each other that a lot of us recognize as problematic or we don't like, but somehow it still seems to enter in new spaces where we're trying to re-envision, we're trying to reimagine what institutions could be, that neighborhoods, that communities control, that actually serve them. So I really do think that the interpersonal is the more difficult work, but it's also the work that needs to be done. In terms of the harms, right, of capitalism, both in our relationships and the interpersonal, but also in our institutions, I think that it's never been as clear as it is now, right? If you know, pandemics are portals, right? And I think, at least for me, what this pandemic did, even in our public discourse, was expose so much of what is harmful about capitalism, right? Literally on mainstream news, people were talking about, well, are we going to sacrifice life or are we going to sacrifice the economy? And if you don't know, we do that every day. We make that choice every day as a society, and we choose the economy. Before the pandemic, we make choices as a collective body, as a country, right, that lift up and certainly give more advantages to capital, to corporations, as opposed to meeting the just basic and material needs that people need to live. And so actually having to say that out loud, actually having a discourse around it, I think got people thinking really about some things. I mean, not going to work, for example, got people thinking about their relationship to work, feeling guilty not being at work, or you're working at home and now you're working more hours than you would if you were actually going to work, right? This has exposed so much of what is so problematic. And more than that, it's exposed the ways in which we've disinvested from public goods, from the things that people actually need to survive, right? When things go wrong, well, we've taken millions and millions of dollars out of our public health system and our hospitals, and people don't have access to healthcare. And so I think the harm, I'm hoping for everyone at this point, the harm is evident. And you might not deal with it, you might be privileged in different ways, but if you don't understand the fallout, and we know in these moments of crises, people who are most oppressed are always going to be, the conditions are always going to be exacerbated in those specific communities. We see Black and brown folks dying we see Indigenous folks dying at increasing rates, right, compared to other folks. So I think the harm is evident, right? What I'm much more interested in talking about is like, how do we build the alternative, right? And solidarity economy is really a practice for us to start building the new economy today, for us to make radically different choices in the way that we actually build institutions, right? In the way that we think of micro economics and microeconomies. And what's most important to me is that, one, people have agency, that people actually can participate in meaningful ways, that people have control over institutions in their lives, right? Just going back a little bit to the abolitionist conversation, right? Solidarity economy is a way in which to get us to abolition. It's a way in which to build not only the alternative institutions that actually keep us safe, that we control, but also the kind of political economy that we would need to actually get rid of the police, right? And so abolition is not just about the undoing of policing and the carceral state, but it's about the redoing of society. And so for me, solidarity economy is the way in which we start redoing the society. And we do that by ensuring that people can participate, they have agency over their lives, they have more control over what's going on in their neighborhoods, and that we aren't constantly in this rush for pro-growth, which, I mean, is driven by capitalism that's only, really profiting a few people. And in the meantime, it's not only making us in a way sick, but it's also making our relationships, difficult. It's making our relationships violent in different ways. And so I'm not sure I got to your question, but the beauty of solidarity economy is that it's about personal transformation, but it's also about how do we transform not just the economy, but society. And we can start doing that today. And I think that's the work that, lawyers can be helpful in.
That was amazing. Thank you, Renee. And I want to just also thank Ali and folks who are in the chat box with questions and comments. We're going to circle back to these, although I think my next question gets a bit to your question, Ali. And I apologize, this was not an email I sent you, but you said, Renee, just brought up for me a question around kind of this moment. And so I think Naomi Klein writes about, in Shock, talking about the ways in which capitalism is very adaptable. And so she writes about Katrina and how in times of crisis, whether it's pandemics or natural, quote unquote, natural disasters, which we know are not natural because of climate change, but the ways in which capital very quickly adjusts, and the way in which politically the kind of pro-capital, pro-free markets, predatory agenda gets implemented very quickly. And so I'm curious, what a moment, and what a year it's been, and sending prayers out to all of us who are surviving this year, from the COVID-19 crisis to now the kind of regurgitation of police and vigilante violence across the country. There's huge opportunities in that, but also huge, I think, opportunities for the other side. And so I'm curious for everyone, this is the question for all the panelists, what are the opportunities of this moment? what are the ways in which you think there's possibilities to really create alternatives to capitalism, to destroy this system that COVID-19 has shown the ruptures in that we can build on? And what are the threats to building something different in this moment? And so in your own organizing, your own lawyering, how you taking advantage of that, and how you also protecting yourself and our movement from what really is, I think, a vulnerable moment as well as a moment of opportunity.
I can jump in.
Bring it.
I want to just say that one of my teachers, even though he's an ancestor now, and maybe because he's an ancestor, Amilcar Cabral, said one time about the role of the petty bourgeois, the role of the petty bourgeoisie, the role of the privileged, the class elites, is to commit class suicide. I struggle with that every day. I know that I'm privileged. I'm an attorney. Most of my folks that I'm honored to be working beside, many did not even get a chance to finish high school. They didn't get the opportunities, yet they brilliantly orchestrate many of the struggles that we wage in our communities. Fannie Lou Hamer, 6th grade scholar. No one can doubt that we are where we are in terms of even having a well, I'm not gonna say choice. I'm not gonna say choice. In terms of being able to touch the screen right now and vote, it's because of these scholars who were in definition unlearned. And we have to shed a lot of our trappings. We have to work on ourselves in order to be of service to our people. And one of the things that we have to really talk about is bad lawyering, bad examples of pimping and hearse chasing. Okay, now I'm telling you, this is Jaribu. It's not everybody, it's just Jaribu. And I'm letting you know that we are gonna have peer-to-peer conversations with some of these folks who are pimping the misery of our people right now as we speak. I vomited in my mouth the other night when I saw some of the stuff, the way this sister whose son is now paralyzed, who was used, you know, in this false narrative of fake ass forgiveness and all the other pieces that go with that, and how you sit there as an advocate and you know that one of the things we should do is care for our clients. Client care is part of what a revolutionary lawyer has to do, and not buckle down and get on the mic every time you can and try to celebritize up some shit that's never gonna work. And you don't even say the word capitalism, and you don't attack the system itself. You don't say a word about the fact that this kid is paralyzed because of racialized capitalism, because he was doomed from the very start. His death warrant was signed. He just survived it. He's a breathing witness, whereas George Floyd is not. So I get enraged when I see the bad lawyering, examples of opportunism, and I see also the allowing of folks to pimp our brand, our slogans, our words. We have to be careful. Don't be mesmerized. Don't be so excited when those who were oppressors yesterday are now talking about Black Lives Matter. Mitt Romney, please, marching through the streets of Utah talking about Black Lives Matter, when as a high schooler, he jumped a kid that they thought was gay and shaved his hair and beat his ass in the school and got away with it. I want to talk about how we as lawyers have to set a better example. And Law for Black Lives, I appreciate you for being on point and helping us understand that political education is the answer. Education of us, though, because the people know why they suffer. Someone said to me, well, they may not know the theory behind it, you know, and that's where we come in. No, you don't come in at all. You don't come in at all if that's the way you're coming in, to provide some false sense of theory when your practice is shot to hell. So I'm saying to all of you, with love and peace to you, that we've got to stop allowing folks who are not right to create this image. We're already hated as lawyers. When you say you're a lawyer, people say, oh, and you have to say, oh, I'm not that kind of lawyer. The reason we have to always say that is because there are people out there who are pimping and using our people's misery in vain, using our people's misery. So I'm saying it, I stand by it, and y'all know I'm not scared. And I'm on all fronts. I can talk about it. I can talk about it with the best of the intellectuals, top of my class. But I can also go down deep into the reaches of the gutter with you to let you know you got to stop. You got to stop. And we're not going to get on CNN and other places. We got to have our own platforms so we can put a stop to the opportunism, the rank opportunism, and the collaboration with the oppressive system of capitalism. It's not going to benefit our people, ever, 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 ever. And if it's benefiting you, then you need to examine who you are in the real scheme of things and stop saying that you're a people's lawyer if you're not really going to do the work. I'm going to do the work on myself. I'm going to commit class suicide every day. I'm going to talk to myself and say, that was messed up what you did yesterday, Jaribu. But I'm not perfect. I make mistakes. But one thing I know is that I have never in my adult life been a sellout. And I will go to my grave with that as my contribution. I cannot understand why we're not vocal on this opportunistic hearse chasing. I stopped calling it ambulance chasing. I'm calling it hearse chasing, and you know who you are. You know who you are. And I dare you to confront me. I dare you to ask me, what do you mean, Jaribu? Because I got you. I got you.
Thank you for
I
that.
didn't even answer your question.
No, you did, because that's one of the threats. I feel like you very clearly articulated what the threat is, and that is horse chasing lawyers, but also more generally the ways in which people are trying to maintain their own class advantage under the guise of our liberation. And so I think you answered the question 100%, and I appreciate you. And I think it's really important that we're angry about that, because as the lawyers who do show up, it's essential that we both are committed to our own transformation, but also that we are calling out folks who are not. So thank you for that. And would love if any other panelists have thoughts about both what are the threats, which I think Julie covered and guide us through, but also what are the opportunities of this moment.
It's hard to say anything after that. I feel like we should just cut the whole thing. Exactly. But I did want to say a couple of things, because I do think the Jaribu point is so powerful. And I don't want us to also jump over the fact that the system, legal education, is set up for people to think that they're supposed to be the hero. I think so many, you know, in being a law professor and working with students every day and working with clients, I think they have this picture in their mind about what their role is that often is, it's more so about them. It's more so about them building their careers. But beyond that, I also want us just to consider the fact that law school, legal curriculum is really set up to ensure that capitalism continues, right? Law school, when you think about the classes that every school teaches, right, is really about making sure that there are folks who can maintain the status quo, legitimize the way in which we structured the economy, legitimize the way in which we structured the criminal justice system or the carceral state. And so much of what they learn is so problematic, and it is presented to them often as if it is objective. It is presented as if it is, you know, more or less just simply how things are. And rarely is there space, at least certainly in my experience in law school, to actually think about the values that are embedded in the law, to think about the way in which law is violence on its face, and in terms of the systems that we set up, in terms of the actual regulations that we've set up, in terms of the ways in which we've ordered and valued and devalued certain things, certain people, certain communities. And then taking it a step further, in the ways in which we know that all these things are implemented is a whole nother layer of oppression that certainly Black folks in this country experience. It's not just what the law says, it's also how they enforce it, right? And that speaks to targeting policing, the way in which policing is used to spur gentrification, the way in which policing is used to basically get rid of a surplus labor force, right? All of the connections between state violence, right, and economic violence is legitimized by the law. And so, you know, in those ways, I mean, I think that the interventions that we have to make too, because folks rarely come, the folks that go to law school, let's think about this, right? They're kind of a self-selected group. Rarely are people radicalized or activated, politically activated before they go to law school. And so once they're there, I think that process becomes that much more difficult. And I really appreciate Julian sharing his story earlier, because I think even if those of us who went to law school seeking justice to figure out like, okay, well, how can I learn this system in service to my people, right? We are still pushed to go into a big law. We're still pushed to go into the firm. Even if you're told, well, just do it for a couple of years, right? We're taught that that's the way in which you actually become a lawyer to a certain extent, right? And so I just want us to think about all the structural ways, right, that lawyers are problematic, that legal education is problematic, and that's why we so rarely, or we produce so few radical lawyers. We produce so few anti-capitalist lawyers, in part because legal education is actually set up to make sure that you're protecting capitalism.
Yes, look at y'all preaching. Thank you for that. Julian or Bianca, do you guys have thoughts also about this question around kind of what are the challenges and what are the opportunities at this moment?
I'll go after Bianca.
Well, I was gonna say Julian go because you're a lawyer. I'm not a lawyer, but regardless, I'll talk about the opportunities that I've seen in this moment. So first of all, there's an uptick in worker organizing. I'm really proud to say that DSA has worked with UE, a union, to start an emergency workplace organizing project. It's been in place since the beginning of the pandemic. It was solely originally used to help workers address health and safety issues like getting PPE or whether or not they had sick leave, and helping them organize around those issues. And now it's turning into full-fledged union organization. What does it mean to have collective bargaining rights against our employers? I think that's huge. And also you saw the strike, the NBA and NBL strike yesterday, strike for Black Lives. And we've seen so many other mobilizations with different levels of workers or different workers, types of workers from all over the country in response to the conditions that we're suffering in this country right now, which is a good thing, in my opinion. The other thing I'll say that I'm really excited about is and I think Renee, you mentioned this, the mutual aid that's happening on a community level has been really moving. Julian and I both participated in an action to occupy our city hall as a means to make a demand to defund the police. And one of the things that we experience right away is that not only do we have to feed people and give them PPE, and just because of the level of pandemic, the level of care that you have to give people in occupation that wouldn't normally be outside of pandemic circumstances. And so we were met with that challenge. And then we started to see, wow, when you put hot food out 3 times a day or 5 times a day or however many times a day we had hot food because we had so much of it, then you start to see people who are housing insecure, young people, families came into the space and really created this community where people were sharing information, sharing supplies, and really getting their needs met, their material needs met from one another and through solidarity. And so I really do, and it was a shame when they broke it up because, the CDC said that it was unsafe for them to break up occupations. And as a result of them breaking up the occupation, we then saw a whole community of almost like 60% of the people, probably, and Julian, you can say, in Occupy City Hall were unhoused people. And so now you have this problem where we're in the middle of the pandemic and people don't even have a place to go. Restaurant places are closed. It's a real big problem. And so I think it's an opportunity for us to come together and really radically care for one another and really explore alternative models to because we are trying to survive this pandemic. And then I'll just say the thing about lawyers. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but one of the things we used to say in the union hall when we were talking strategy was the lawyer's job is to get us out of trouble, not to tell us what not to do. So may you all endeavor to be the types of lawyers that get us out of trouble and not say no.
Yes, I love that. We often say that lawyers are taught to say no as well. And so how do we open our imaginations and follow the leadership of folks who are doing it big? Thank you so much for that. Julian, what you got?
Yeah, so I have 3 recommendations. 1 is practice governance. 2 is find opportunities to practice governance. And then 3 is build institutions where you can practice governance. And the reason I think that is so important is that underneath that is relationship building. And you can go years in New York City and be on one block and not know more than like 5 people on your block, right? And I wonder how that looks in other places. And so one of the opportunities, I think, in connection with the mutual aid efforts, and I know BYP 100 worked on one as well with Decrim NY, as well as organizations doing migrant work, is that, you know, this is an opportunity to start building that muscle, right? Like, I think if you're in an apartment building, y'all could be doing some governance stuff there, right? Who's on your block, right? Do your social distancing, you know, but get to know folks. Like, we have to start practicing governance in ways that we're just not. And there's so many opportunities to do that, right? Practicing how do we make decisions, practicing how do we think about values. A lot of harm happened at places like Occupy and other places, right? And those are things that we need to work through, right? If we're talking about not relying on the state, not relying on practices that are about punishment, we have to practice the alternative. We can't just talk about it. We can't be learning, oh, okay, what's transformative justice? Okay, what's restorative justice? Like, yeah, now we need to build those circles. We need to struggle through it. And I think that is my main offering in terms of opportunities. Just find the different levels. Find the level where you can start that up, because the folks who are governing right now are not governing for our benefits. And as I mentioned before, you know, we talk about monopolies and how you're talking about concentrated power in markets, but these also are capturing our political institutions, right? So it's like so many levels to this. And if we're not finding ways to build those alternatives, like right now, as in like tomorrow, like next week, we're just gonna keep kind of going through these conversations where it's like, yeah, you know, these systems are really messed up. But the hard work, and it's hard work, the hard work is to struggle through finding ways to practice governance. And that's the only way that's the only way, because we've seen many examples in all parts of the world where folks took power, there's a vacuum, and folks never practice governance. And what you got a person of color basically holding the same type of power position that the white folks had before. So I yield my time. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I want to also resonate with, I think, Madhu in the comments of like that way of thinking about it. It's really, I think, revealing. So thank you, Julian. I think a bridge to this question is around what all things you guys are seeing, whether it's organizing or legal work or anything in between, that you think is really inspirational and promising. So are you seeing examples of governance practicing? Are you seeing examples of building mutual aid? I think, Bianca, you touched on this, that are really inspiring to you and that give you hope around the possibilities and the imagination of anti-capitalism. This is shout out your people time. So tell us, who are the people who you think are doing incredible work?
Can I just give a shout out to Carmen? Carmen Huertas Noble is on the line, the person who ushered me into this work. So I just want to acknowledge Carmen and the work that Carmen's doing over at CUNY Law. Shout out.
Yeah. Oh, CUNY, that's my school. That's where I went.
I love that. Thank you for that, Julian, and thank you, Carmen.
Well, I want to shout out to essential workers in our state who are battling against retaliation, who've been confronting the powers that be, even the neo-colonial powers who claim to be in our corner, claim to be going out there and helping us. They really are not. They're race traders, and we have to deal with that within the discussion around class struggle. We certainly have to deal with that. And we have to also deal with how we strategize, because what I'm seeing, when folks step out and they raise contradictions around the slate, that's not the orange man, the slate, and we got to swallow whole if we want to get the orange man out. Don't do it in a way where you think that I'm some kind of idiot or a fool and that I don't remember the transgressions of these folks. I hate it when people do it, become a poster child for these folks. You could strategically tell people, let's dump Trump. You ain't got to be no poster child for politics and imagery that's never worked for our people. And someone mentioned a little while ago when Kamala Harris was so supportive of the police and keep continuing to fund the police during the time of, Oscar Grant and other cases. We cannot glorify folks. We cannot praise them or give them false praise. What we have to do is make sure they understand that this is a strategic move. This has nothing to do with lifting you up or forgiving you for hurting our people. I think it's real important that we take that class stance. Some folks that I trust so much and respect so much have been coming out, making silly statements and being poster children for these different despots. And I'm hurt, I'm crushed by it, but it also gives me inspiration when I see young people who are daring to go up against the system, daring to go up against the corporate powers, the rulers, the robber barons, and really, really understanding the connection to those systems and the holders of those systems, the connection to that and our oppression. And they are not backing down. They're not listening to the bullshit narratives on CNN or MSNBC or wherever saying, oh, but you're destroying things, you're violent, you're doing. No, they are understanding what resistance is and what righteous indignation is. And we have to support them. We got to represent them if they get in harm's way, if they get arrested, we got to represent them. And I'm not talking about hearse chasing. I'm not talking about opportunistic ventures where you're getting rich, you fat cat. You're getting rich off of our people's suffering. I'm talking about actually, who's the lawyer representing? I am. I'm here representing and watching as they quake in their boots because they know you, because you have a reputation for not bowing down. And I think that's what we have to do. And Julian, I want to say to my brother, you are not the only one who has had to grapple with whether you're going to be able to pay your loans or whether you're going to be able to do A, B, C, and D. We have to understand when someone righteous comes to us and speaks truth to us, and they are not selling us out, then we have to celebrate that. So I appreciate you, brother. I appreciate your self-reflection. And I know that there are those out there who never self-reflect because they are against us. And they got their sheepskin and their bar card, but they're against us. And I've told some of them in Balsa, they say, what advice do you have for us? I said, if you're not for Black freedom, change professions right now. Run to the hills and change professions. I'm a singer, I'm an actress. If I'm not for my people, I can go back to doing that. Don't stick around in the bar if you're not for Black freedom. And I'm only speaking now to Black lawyers and brown lawyers and lawyers who know they're oppressed. If you are a lawyer who should be representing poor white people because you came from poor white people, then don't sell your people out, is what I'm trying to say. And your skills and your abilities, those are a given because of your privilege. I can talk good because I'm a preacher's daughter. But what am I saying? And what am I doing? That's the question. Not that I'm an orator, but what am I saying out of my mouth and what I'm doing with my body? That's what's important.
Thank you for that, Jaribu. Yes. So I'm gonna move us to the questions in the box, but I wanna give Renee and Bianca, if you guys have any organizations you wanna shout out or examples of projects that you're super inspired by, I wanna give you the chance to do that.
Well, right now, I'm inspired by so much. I'm inspired by the folks that are in the streets. I'm inspired by all of the organizing that's been done in the middle of what, is very harsh, tough conditions. I'm inspired by the fact that people are talking about radical care in those spaces in different ways. And just thinking, for example, at this moment of all the things that are going, all the moving parts, right? All the ways that we're organizing. The movement for Black Lives is having a national Black political agenda to our convention tomorrow. And I'm inspired in part because they are seriously doing electoral work while understanding that electoral politics is not going to free us, right? But that's a place that we have to struggle. And so also thinking about the ways in which we're struggling for the commons and struggling to move on, to move the government in certain ways, but also really just understanding that we have to create our own institutions that work for us, right, that we control, and that's going to be an ongoing thing that we're doing. But in terms of, more locally, there's been such amazing mutual aid here, and really it has almost popped up like neighborhood by neighborhood, people that know each other, people calling and checking on each other, people going to the grocery store for each other, feeding folks. I definitely want to lift up Shy Fresh Kitchen. It's a new worker co-op that's owned by majority of like Black women who have had experiences with the carceral state, who are doing meal prep here in the city of Chicago, who are also donating meals to feed folks, who are bringing food out to Juneteenth celebrations, but also, you know, starting and expanding really their own business very quickly and working for themselves, in part because they could not access meaningful work. There's, I mean, really, I could talk so much. I mean, there's so much really amazing work and organizing that's happening around solidarity economy. A lot of that is related to worker co-ops, more recently to mutual aid, but people are still struggling and trying to build out a time bank here in Chicago and getting us to use it in different ways, given now that, you know, a lot of folks can't afford their rent, can't afford food, right? The cancel the rent strikes have been really inspiring, because it just shows the ways in which we're organizing and coming together, really to break the back of capitalism, right? To build power, right? To try to actually shift the political economy to work in ways that actually reinforce the needs of people.
Yes, thank you for that. Bianca, do you have anything you want to share or add to that?
I just want to shout out the City Waste Union workers in New Orleans who are really fighting for their livelihoods. Black sanitation workers who are up against, you know, all of the things that the essential workers in this country are up against, having to choose between their livelihoods and their lives, of, you know, themselves and their families. And so I want to lift them up and encourage all of you to find ways to support them, whether it be monetary or just signing their petition. I also want to lift up teachers who are trying to figure out how to navigate this virtual learning, you know, after having to fight, many of them, and are still in a fight about what it looks like to safely reopen schools and have that fight with government. And so I just really want to lift them up because I know that that's not easy, and that won't be an easy fight for those of them who are still fighting that. And I also want to lift up the people in the streets. I want to lift up the people who are sick and tired of being sick and tired. I want to lift up the people who understand that electoral politics is not the way that we're going to win, but see these atrocious options that we have and want to put forward a vision, an anti-capitalist vision, a collective vision of something radically different. So shout out to them, and shout out to all the truth tellers who are calling out the Democrats, calling out all of the wolves in sheep's clothing, because it's not easy. But we all have to stick together, and there ain't enough of us, so we really have to stick together.
Yes. Oh, y'all are fire. Thank you for that, Bianca. So I want to start with some of the questions in the chat box and maybe do kind of a lightning round, because there's quite a few, and want to also appreciate folks who are answering each other. This is really a collective knowledge space, so really appreciate folks bringing their own expertise to the table. But one question a while back from Ali was around, do you see this pandemic as actually changing the systems that we're inside of? And how so, I think, is a question. So do you see this kind of moment of exposing capitalism for its evils as possibly leading us to change? So I'll open that up for folks if they want to answer that.
I think it's actually going to deepen inequality. I think it's going to deepen racial inequality. I think what it is doing, I think, is raising a number of folks' consciousness. But the impact, you know, I think someone mentioned earlier just the way in which small business, I think Julian was talking about the way in which small businesses in New York are being hit. We know that businesses who are owned by Black folks, Latinx folks, other folks of color have been hit the hardest. We know that they were less likely to receive any kind of aid from the federal government, from other programs. And so when we come out on the other side of this, you have to understand a lot of folks in Black communities and other communities like see starting their business as a way in which to sustain themselves. A lot of times there's a lot of money on the line, and really in terms of feeding their family or their household, you know, all of that, and to a certain extent, has been undone. It's been washed away to a certain extent. And so, in thinking about the recovery, I think it's actually going to make things worse. We know, for example, like Jeff Bezos is making billions of dollars, right, within the hour. However, we know that a lot of small business owners, we know that people who, frontline workers, right, are really being hit, aren't receiving hazard pay. when you think about, or someone who suffers, right, from the coronavirus and might not now have legal expenses because they don't have healthcare. I think it's actually going to make things worse in terms of our economic conditions. However, I think it's opened a lot of eyes in terms of, one, just how the government is not necessarily going to come to our aid in moments of crises, and that we have to be able to step in and take care of each other. But then two, really people understanding that there's something very wrong with this system, way beyond Trump.
Okay, thank you for that. Another question in the chat box is around what kinds of legal structures need to be created to advance socialism and anti-capitalist economies. And so I think, Julian, you started to answer this in the chat box, so we'd love to hear folks talk more about what are the structures that we need to put in place when we have the opportunity to replace this system.
Yeah, there's gonna come a time when, and that time is now, for us to actually be about intentional institution building that does not mirror the system that is oppressing us. Many of the nonprofit organizations, 501c3 organizations, are organized to our detriment, unfortunately. If your legal organization is not actually looking at the work through a human rights radical lens, then that organization is actually shoring up the status quo. And you're doing it with gloss and pedigree. You're doing it in a way where people will accept it because it's you that's offering it to them. So when you're serving up these compromising main course meals, that's our problem. We need more revolutionary lawyers. And I come out of the tradition. Before I was a lawyer, I was a cultural artist. I'm still a cultural artist. And I used to perform a lot for the National Conference of Black Lawyers meetings and conventions. And my early teacher in the law was Chokwe Lumumba before I even became a lawyer. And I mean that type of lawyering that's steeled in, not just chipping away at the status quo, but standing in the gap with our people as they take it down. That's what we need. We need institutions like that. I was so excited when I came to the inaugural Law for Black Lives, conference, because for once I saw the possibility of having peers. And I'm not saying that in an elitist way. I'm saying that often I do not have peers, because just because you're Black and you got a law degree and you got a license doesn't make you somebody who's going to stand up for our people. What will make you stand up? Political education like this. And Marbre, thank you for asking us to share resources and putting together a clearinghouse of resources where people can read and study. We need study groups. We need legal organizations that don't just go to court, but actually tell people why, if you didn't win. We stand outside under the tree when we come out of a hearing embattled. We'll say, now the reason you didn't win that is because of this. It's not because you didn't raise righteous demands, not because you shouldn't have filed that lawsuit, but you filed it under a system that's against us. The reason I'm bringing you a Thanksgiving basket is because you're hungry in the richest country in the world. So we've got to figure out a way to push out a narrative that goes along with the resistance movement, and lift up young people who are out there, steadfastly out there, taking on these systems, and stop allowing people like Van Jones and the rest of them to criticize, and that Don Lemon to chastise revolutionaries. Even the mother said she doesn't want the violence. I want to smack you in your face, okay? Because I'm so tired of it. I'm sick of these types trying to quell and smother resistance. And we're talking about young people, we always say, oh, wow, they're destructive. They don't do this, they don't do that. But then they go to the streets and resist. And we're the very ones who try to put them down. And my age group, the baby boomers, that is what we do best. And we need to stop doing it.
Yes, thank you for that. Do other folks want to comment on that one? Like mic drop. Thank you, Jaribu. That's also.
Can we make that happen since we got the same last name? Can we just be cousins now?
I think we have to be cousins. Okay. You're too young to be anything else to me, but because that would just be gross. But we have to be cousins. We absolutely have to be. Although I'm looking pretty good, though. I'm looking pretty youthful. But it would be, believe me, trust me when I say that. But yes, absolutely, absolutely. Let's do it. Let's be thought partners. Let's think of a way to work together, even in this pandemic. Let's do it. Let's absolutely do it.
I love it. We're making family.
Oh yes, making family.
I love it.
Back
Love
to Marbre and our regular scheduled program.
No, that was beautiful. I appreciate you. Beautiful. I think there's another question here about any thoughts on abolishing fractional reserve banking towards ending American capitalism. I'm gonna let somebody beside me take that question. And this is from CJ Valoris. Thank you for that, CJ. I also, while folks think about that, want to just shout out, I think Jaribu mentioned, so one of the kind of goals of this is to educate ourselves around these concepts. And so LPBO will have a newsletter coming out tomorrow, as well as on our website, resources from each of these amazing speakers to get yourself educated around anti-capitalism and socialism and southern economies and all of the things. And so check out the LPBO website in the next few days to see those resources and continue this kind of journey of self-education. Hal also asked, is Jackson Rising a model that people that should be followed?
I don't see
Yeah.
that.
So we got 2 questions in the mix. Renee said modern money theory is organized around that. Which one, Renee?
Your last question. But so, I mean, one of the things I want to say, because I think somebody also asked, okay, if this is what we need to do, how do we do it? And I think part of what I want is to connect these things. To a certain extent, we're talking about the ways in which to do it, right? So when Julian said, start governing, right? Really what that is about being in community and struggling with folks, because you have to be in those spaces to do the personal transformational work. When you think about creating a different kind of society, one where more people can participate, more people have agency, more folks, right, have what they need, it requires us to practice, to develop a certain muscle to actually engage with each other differently. And the way we do that is by starting to practice to do that, right? Obviously, in addition to that, using your legal skills in service to community, using your legal skills in service to building institutions that people actually want and need in their own neighborhoods, communities, right? That is also a part of that work. And so when I say solidarity economy, it's really a praxis, right? It's a theory, it's also a movement, but it's a practice. And so when I think about my own work, when I, for example, decide what case to take or what organizations to work with, I think about what those principles and values are that I think should be embedded, right, in what we create in the new economy. Things like the ecological, right, principles, or things like, right, anti-racism, thinking about equity in all dimensions, thinking about anti-patriarchy, thinking about addressing the ways in which the economy currently oppresses, right, different folks in different ways, but also thinking about participatory budgeting, thinking about things like land trust, thinking about things like land reform, right? So Black folks, other folks of color aren't currently dispossessed of their land, aren't currently moved off of their land, which is essentially what gentrification is, right, by capital. So what we're saying is that there are folks doing this work in every corner of the country right now, right? A lot of those folks might need legal support, but more importantly, right, really being grounded in community, right? Being accountable to folks is like a first step. And that is the way, building these types of institutions, linking them up, being in relationship with each other differently. That is how we start. That's the process that we need to continuously start to put ourselves through, and continuously reflecting and adapting and adjusting as we need to along the way, and recognizing that likely some of those systems of oppression will show up in our spaces, and that we have to be prepared to address them, right? Doing the interpersonal work.
Thank you for that. We are actually almost out of time. So I want to actually give each of the panelists about 30 seconds to 45 seconds to just close us out. So whatever comes up for you or you want to share before we close out, just to give you a chance to do that. And again, to thank y'all. Y'all are incredible luminaries who who are doing incredible work, and we're so grateful you guys took the time on this Thursday to be with us. And so I'll let folks speak as they feel moved to, but just any close out comments you want to make.
Yeah, I can start and we can save the best for last. So yeah, I'm just gonna say that we have to, like I said, find opportunities to practice governance, and you can literally start tomorrow. If you're doing mutual aid, if you are going to protests, right? How can you keep those relationships moving beyond that? If you're gonna do get out the vote, right? How can you knock on people's doors and also invite them to come to a community meeting, right? And so just how do we find ways to build those sort of connections that are enduring, doing the stuff that we do every day? Check.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I'll just say, this conversation is making me think that I guess there are a lot of people who are saying what's going to be fundamentally different coming out of this uprising? What will be different coming out of this pandemic? But the question, we're asking the wrong people. We should be asking ourselves, how are we going to be different coming out of this? Because it really is up to us. And so that means changing our priorities as a society, deciding what we're going to spend time and money on, deciding what we're going to stand up and fight and what we're going to sit down and take. And that's on all of us. And so that goes back to the community building that Julian's talking about and Renee is talking about getting involved in your community, but also re-examining your heart and unlearning all of that stuff and that filth that we've learned through capitalism, patriarchy, and white supremacy, undoing it ourselves.
Yes, I just want to bring Mary Hooks into the space of being transformed in service of the walk. And so what does that mean for our practices? Thank you, Bianca. Jaribu, do you want to close us out? Give us a word.
I just, I'm so inspired. You know, I'm a very emotional person. I could break down and cry right now at the way that we've been able to unpack and look at issues as revolutionaries without apology. And so I'll just say a system that began with the theft of human flesh, murder, and genocide cannot be our resting home, cannot be our final destination. And if we are not speaking truth to power every day, I don't care if it's about the election coming up, I don't care what it's about, if we are resentful of people because they call out these despots, whatever color they come in, and we're on the wrong side of history. I can't tell you how many times I've received nasty text messages. Well, this is not the time. She's qualified. She's great. I like her. And I don't give a shit if you like her. And that's not the point. The point is not whether you like her or she's in your sorority. The point is we can't just have our people swallow whole anybody who has hurt us. And even in our strategic way of trying to get rid of this monster that's there now, and don't boogeyman him. Don't boogeyman him. His blood is red. He bleeds like we bleed. And our problem many times is that we're in this hysteria moment where we're traumatized. And we've been through these despots before, and now he's one of the worst examples right now. But we better not put on those rose-colored glasses and expect that the authors of the crime bill are going to save Black people. Now, I'm just saying, I'm saying it to you in truth. In truth. They absolutely can't, because they believe in the system that wants to kill you and is killing you. And it's just a true fact. I mean, you can't even be mad at them. They're doing what they believe in. But the question is, like Renee said and others have said, what are we doing?
I love that.
We know that they're doing that and we shouldn't be mad at them for that. But what are we doing as revolutionaries?
Beautiful. Thank you for that. That's just like the perfect ending. So thank you all for tuning into this. Thank you, panelists, for your brilliance and your work. Again, we will have all these resources up and this webinar recording on our website. Check us out. Our newsletter will also include a list of resources from each of the panelists and now from each of y'all. And so if you have more resources you want to share with us, info@lawforblacklives.org is the way to do it. And again, thank y'all so much. Sending blessings and love. I really appreciate y'all.
Love you.
Love y'all. Bye.
Mwah.